Now, in this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at tools that copy one portion of an image onto another portion of an image. You may recall back in lesson 1, we went ahead and copied those trees on top of each other in front of the Stanley Hotel. Well, that's called cloning. That's the term for it. And we're going to learn all about cloning inside this lesson, how it applies to the clone stamp tool, first and foremost, and then we'll move on to the healing brush and the patch tools. Now, I want you to open up two images. One's called aged1.jpg, and the other one's called lightfabric.photospin.jpg. It's from the Photospin image library. And the aged one I shot at the Victoria and Albert Museum. They're both inside the Lesson 9 folder, which is inside the Part 1 folder, which is inside, of course, the project files folder that you copied from the DVD to your hard drive. Now, I'd like you to go over here to the toolbox and see this little guy right there, the clone stamp tool. I want you to click on it to select it or press the S key for stamp. And this tool goes ahead and paints from one section of the image onto a different section of the image. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the brush size a little bit by pressing the right bracket key until I get about an 80 pixel brush. It's not necessary that you follow exactly along with me because we're just playing at this point to get a sense for how this tool works. Don't just start in painting. If you do, Photoshop will get angry with you. And when Photoshop's angry, that is not a pretty thing. What it does is it barks at you, brings up an error message telling you that you need to set a source point. Because before you can paint from one portion of the image onto a different portion of the image, you have to specify what you want your source point to be. Where do you want to clone from? And you do that by pressing the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and clicking. That's all you have to do, just a single click. And I went ahead and Option clicked right there on this part of the ear, on this guy's head. That would be an Alt click on a PC. And then I'm going to begin dragging just a little farther up so that I sort of clone two ears on top of each other. And notice you can see, as I drag, you can see two cursors. You can see a round brush cursor, and below that you can see a cross-shaped source cursor. So it shows me what I'm cloning from, the cross, and where I'm cloning it to, the circle. And notice as I drag, notice right now I've got the cross and the circle on new portions of the ear. But Photoshop is not cloning the new portion of the ear. It's always cloning the old portion of the ear. It's always cloning from the original, which is a really great thing. This isn't always the way it was inside Photoshop. They had to fix this. Once upon a time, it used to just sit there and replicate over and over again. And it just sort of ruined the reality of the tool. Not that what I'm doing right now is too super real, mind you, but still. Now, I'm done dragging. We've got two ears on top of each other at this point. What if you want to fade things out a little bit? I'm going to do that. I'm going to paint some more stuff here. I could just start painting in like that some more because I have defined my source point, and I could just go ahead and paint a little more if I wanted to. And notice that my new brush stroke is aligned with my old brush stroke, so my edits are aligned with each other. And that's thanks to this checkbox right there that says aligned. All right? So that makes sure that each and every brush stroke I apply is aligned with that very first brush stroke. And that can be a handy thing for matching different healing strokes with each other. But I'm going to go ahead and backstep a little bit, Command-Z, and then Command-Option-Z. That would be Control-Z, Control-Alt-Z on the PC if you're diligently following along with me. This is an interesting use of the tool, sort of duplicating ears on a guy's head, I suppose. What's a more accurate use of the tool? Something you might actually want to do with it. Well, I'm going to zoom in here. Notice that we've got a little dent in this guy's head. See this? There's this eyebrow here, and then there's another dent, and it looks like I've gone and cloned the eyebrow from here up to here, and there's some breaks in the wrinkles as well that makes it look like I have a digital edit right here. I don't. This is the photograph I shot. It just so happens that this statue has a characteristic of digital cloning built into it. That's wild. This guy was way ahead of his time. But I don't want people thinking that I did this, so I'm going to sort of cover it up. And I'm going to go down here to this neutral area of his face that just has a few wrinkles sitting around, and I'm going to Option-click it, or Alt-click it on the PC. And then I'm going to start in painting over this area. Well, if I just start in painting, it looks pretty rotten. Doesn't look like it belongs there at all. It's a nice fuzzy brush, so we've got some soft transitions, but I still don't believe it, even sort of. So I'm going to undo that modification. Notice the opacity value right now is set to 100%. I'm going to press the 5 key to reduce it to 50%. And I'm going to try painting again. And that's better. I think, that does the trick. Actually, I think I'll leave out that last brush stroke there. Let's take in the effect from more of a distance. And that looks semi-believable. Why don't we add maybe a few more wrinkles into the picture? I'll go right to this point here, sort of this wrinkle guy right there, and I'll option click on it. And then I'm going to move my cursor down and paint just a little bit in this territory. And that, to me, looks a little better. Now, it doesn't look completely right. And you may notice when cloning with the stamp tool, it's never going to look completely right as you're doing it. It's often the kind of thing that you want to maybe step away from the picture, come back, try to evaluate whether you got it right or not. So in other words, sort of cleanse your mind for a moment, because otherwise you're always seeing those brush strokes. You're always aware of which brush strokes you applied and which details were already there, something that your viewer is not going to be aware of. All right, so there are a couple ways to use the clone stamp tool. One is to go ahead and duplicate portions of an image. Another is to try to fix portions of an image. You can also, however, clone from one image into a different image, and that's why I had you open the light fabric image. We're just going to go ahead and paint from the aged one image into the light fabric image. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and zoom into this image and move your cursor so that the little cross in the center of the cursor is all the way in the upper left-hand corner of the image, as far as possible up there. Then press the Option key or the Alt key on a PC and click. Now, you should click inside the image window. If you Option click outside the image window on your desktop, Photoshop's going to disappear on the Mac. So just make sure that you're inside the image when you Option click, or Alt click, of course, on the PC. And then I'm going to bring over my light fabric image here, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on it as well. Make sure that aligned is turned on, that aligned checkbox is turned on. And I'm going to go up to the upper left-hand corner of the image window and click again. And what I've done is I've registered the first image with the second image. I've just made sure that they're now going to be completely in alignment with each other. And I'm going to undo that modification. So I'm going to undo that brush stroke I applied. Now, though, I can paint inside any place in the image because the brush stroke will be aligned. Even though I undid it, the alignment point has been saved. Photoshop is going to pay attention to that alignment point. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm just going to go ahead and zoom out from the image a bit. I'm going to increase my brush size. And if I start painting, notice that his face comes into the image at the exact same point it appears in the original. So I'll go ahead and zoom out from it too so that we can see. His face is in about the center of the image in the original, and it's in about the center as well here. See? Complete perfect alignment thanks to the fact that I took the time to align the two images by Alt-clicking or Option-clicking and then clicking. All right. And then at this point, I can just brush wherever I want to get this sort of faded effect. So just basically fade this statue into the fabric image like so. And if I wanted to, I could even apply a blend mode to this image as I paint. So for example, right here's the mode option inside the options bar. And I'll change that mode from normal, which just paints a normal brush stroke subject to the opacity value. I'll change it to overlay, which does a great job of blending one image with another image and retaining all the detail, all the luminosity values inside both of the images. Does a really great job of merging the two. And I'm going to even increase the opacity value back to 100% by pressing the 0 key. Notice it's now at 100%. And I will brush in again. And notice what it does. Notice even though I'm painting over these details here, I'm painting over this fabric, I can still see the fabric texture below. So it doesn't get rid of the fabric texture, it just merges the two images into each other, which I think is a really becoming effect. With, of course, the exception of the fact that this guy has two ears. That looks a little weird. But otherwise, I think it looks pretty nice. I think it looks pretty nifty. I'll just go ahead and brush in some of the bottom portion of this guy. And there's my final effect, my final blending of this statue along with this fabric background, thanks to the clone stamp tool mixed, in this case, with the overlay blend mode. All right, so much for the clone stamp tool. Wonderful tool, really excellent stuff. We're going to now move on to the healing functions in Photoshop, which, if anything, are more extraordinary. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize these two windows here. And notice in the background, I've covertly opened another image that I'd like you to open. It's also inside the Lesson 9 folder. That's inside the Part 1 folder. and it's called needlessseams.jpg. And this is another replica at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I just love this place. However, I guess somehow the way the replica was made, it involved seams of some sort, and I'd like to go ahead and get rid of those seams. And I'm going to do that by using the healing brush. And the healing brush is over here. It's this little Band-Aid icon right there. Now, your tool may still be set to the red eye tool if you've been working in order. If it is, just go ahead and switch to the Spot Healing Brush tool. Now, this tool is new to Photoshop CS. It comes from Elements, by the way. It comes from Photoshop Elements 3. And I must say, I don't care for it. Photoshop sometimes does take tools from Elements. For example, it took the red eye tool from Elements, and that's a great tool. I love the way that one works. This Spot Healing Brush is supposed to be an easy-to-use tool as well, and it is easy to use. You just start in painting with it. However, it frequently works incorrectly. So the idea is you don't have to specify a clone point. You know the way you have to specify a clone point with a clone stamp tool? Well, with this Spot Healing Brush, you don't have to. You don't specify a clone point, you just start in painting. So I'll just start painting over one of these seams, and notice as I'm painting, the seam ends up just looking darker, just to show me where my brushstroke is. As soon as I release, then it goes ahead and finds some similar portion of the image, supposedly, and then just fills in a seam. Now, sometimes it works brilliantly. Like this time right now, it worked great. I think that was a really good one. I'm going to increase the size of the brush a little more here. But sometimes it doesn't work so well. I'll go ahead and clone another brushstroke and see, well, that one works too. See, this is Photoshop's way of making me look bad, frankly. I must say, this is what I don't appreciate about this tool, is how it's making me look bad right now. There we go. Now it messed up. And that's the problem. I'll go ahead and undo that and try it again. I'm going to go ahead and drag up this seam right here. As soon as I release, what happens? Well, it grabs stuff from the wrong portion of the image. It is cloning from a different portion of the image. The difference is Photoshop is deciding which portion of the image to clone instead of letting you decide which portion of the image to clone, which I think, frankly, is kind of a bad thing because although it's easier to use and you let Photoshop be in charge and all that jazz, letting Photoshop be in charge isn't always a good thing. Sometimes Photoshop makes good decisions like down here, and sometimes it makes rotten decisions like up here. What do we do when Photoshop makes a rotten decision? Well, we undo, of course, naturally, and then go over to the healing brush icon here, click and hold on it, and choose the regular old, good old healing brush tool that was Photoshop's invention back in Photoshop 7 and is therefore quite good. Those two things don't always follow, but in this case, it does. And this tool happens to work just like the clone stamp tool. That is to say, you decide what you want to clone first. So I'm going to option click over here in this neutral area of the face. And then I'm going to drag along a portion of the seam. And notice as I drag it just as a standard clone, you can see the area that I clone. As soon as I release, the brush stroke and the underlying original are merged together to form a seamless patch over this portion of the image. Now I'd like to draw your attention to a few options up here inside the options bar, starting with aligned. Notice that the aligned checkbox for the healing brush is turned off by default, where it was turned on by default for the clone stamp tool. Well, those are pretty good settings, actually. When you're cloning an image especially from one image to another image, like we did at the end there, having a line turned on is a really good thing. That way, you keep each brushstroke aligned with the previous one. However, when you're healing portions of an image, you want more variety than that. You don't want that strict alignment, typically. And it's really nice to be able to clone from that same point inside the image over and over again. And I will demonstrate, for example, now that I've specified that this neutral area of the image is my clone from, my source point, then I can clone to all kinds of other portions of the image, like I might drag down here. And notice, even though this brush stroke that I'm painting, this area that I'm painting from, is so much lighter than the new area, these two brush strokes blend together beautifully. And the way Photoshop works this magic is that it evaluates the area around the brush stroke and recruits luminosity values, decides what luminosity this new brush stroke should be. So what that means is that it's just really recruiting the texture from the source area and mixing it with the colors and the brightness values from the new area, from the Clone 2 area of the image. It does a beautiful job of ensuring that you end up with seamless patches. And if you're not so happy with what you end up painting here, just go ahead and source from a different location, Option-click again, and paint again in order to fill in that area. Now, you can even fill in missing details. For example, notice this ear that got knocked off. I'll go ahead and paint that back in. Just go ahead and paint in that earlobe. And as soon as I release, notice that it does a pretty decent job over here on the right-hand side because it was able to recruit colors from this area of the image. That is the brown area of the image. But over here, we've got some drift of orange sort of plowing into the earlobe, and that's because it's recruiting from this orange background. So you have to be watchful of where these sampled colors are coming from. You may find it easier to just go ahead and clone in some missing details. And I'll go ahead and switch to the clone tool. I can either, by the way, switch to the clone tool, or I can stick with the healing brush, and I can set the healing brush to a different mode, namely the replace mode. And when a healing brush is set to the replace mode, it basically behaves like the clone stamp tool. That is to say, it replaces one portion of the image with a different portion of the image. So I'll go ahead and Option-click inside the cheek here in order to set a clone from point, and then I'm going to drag inside this little orange part of the ear here in the earlobe. And I'm being very careful to fill this in nicely. Now, you might think, well, why don't I clone from an edge? Doesn't that make more sense to clone from this area so that we have this dark boundary, for example? The thing is, it's very difficult to find an edge that's exactly the same angle. For example, if I clone from here, if I set this as a source point, and then I start painting, notice how far off it is. And I could try again. I could keep sort of painting with it since it's not aligned. Notice the align checkbox is turned off. Since it's not aligned, I could keep trying different paint points here, so that didn't quite work, so I'll try it down a little bit. And I could eventually come up with something that works halfway well angle-wise, but it doesn't look too darn good in terms of this sort of little divot that appears right here and so on. It just doesn't end up working very well, so I'm going to undo that modification. Now, of course, the problem I do have is that we don't have any shading dark-wise down here, and light-wise up here, it's not a good patch. Now that I've put in some earlobe to work from, I'll go ahead and return to the patch mode, the normal mode for the healing brush. And I will once again Option-click in this neutral area here. I'll maybe expand my brush size just a little bit. And I'll paint in there, and that looks pretty nice. In terms of the shading on the top of the ear, how do we get the darkness down here? Well, I might suggest our old friend now, the burn tool. And I'm going to decrease the size of this tool. It's set to an exposure of 90%. Oh, good gosh. I'll change that down to 50% here. And I will go ahead and just paint along the bottom of the earlobe. And this looks pretty nice to me. Now, it maybe doesn't match as well as it could. We'd have to work on it a little more. But you get the sense of how we might rebuild details inside of an image. All right, I'm going to return to the healing brush by pressing the J key, incidentally. All the healing brush options here, every single one of these tools, is available by pressing J. It may look like I here on the Mac, but it's actually J. It's just a very slim font. And I think I might as well go ahead and fix up this ear a little better. I'm going to Option-click, actually over here on his face, a nice neutral area. And I'm going to reduce the size of my brush and just click at that intersection right there, maybe a few times, in order to smooth out that transition. And then I'm going to switch back to the burn tool by pressing the O key, reduce the size of that cursor, and paint along this earlobe a little more, maybe not like that, maybe like this here. So you get the idea of how you might go about replacing a detail. It does take a little bit of work, a little bit of finessing back and forth. But in time, you can do it. No, you can. Good luck with that. All right, so what else might you do with this tool? We've got still more seams to heal, don't you know? So I'm going to press the J key to get back to the healing brush. Now, the other blend modes can come in handy for darkening the image while you paint and so on. You might want to try them out if you like. But you will notice up here in the options bar, something is missing. Notice that we're missing any form whatsoever of an opacity value. We don't have opacity or exposure or flow or any of those controls that we've seen in the past. But it turns out we do have a way to get around that. They don't appear up here in the options bar, but let me show you a special trick. I'm going to come down here lower inside the image, because we've got this stuff that I want to heal, and I'm not very happy with this patch, so we'll go ahead and fix that. I'm going to increase the size of my brush a couple of jots here. I'm going to Option-click or Alt-click, again, in this neutral area, and I'm going to drag down along here. Now, that looks pretty good. I'll go and zoom in some more so that we can see it close up here. It looks pretty good, but it doesn't look great. So let's say you like the brush stroke you applied, but you don't love it. So in other words, you don't want to completely undo it, but you don't want to keep it completely either. Well, gosh, no problem. You can fade it by going up to the Edit menu and choosing, remember this option, the Fade command. And now it says Fade Healing Brush. And sure enough, just like that, check it out, we have an opacity value associated with the healing brush. And I can fade that healing brush back a little bit so that it produces a better match for us. Now, the thing about this solution, it's a really good one. It's nice that it exists. However, you're probably not going to want to use it on a super regular basis. In other words, you're not going to want to paint a brush stroke, then choose fade, and paint another brush stroke and choose fade, because the fade command only affects the very last brush stroke you apply. So just remember that. You only have one chance to fade right after you paint the brush stroke. Okay, and from then on, your tool returns to being an opaque tool. So I'm going to make my tool a little bit smaller here and paint along this side. And you can always heal multiple times over a single area to try to see if that's going to do the trick for you. Just keep trying to heal over it, see if that helps. But avoid healing too much. Avoid scrubbing over the area multiple times, because if you do scrub over it too often, then you may create something that's an obvious patch. And you just have to watch that. And you'll learn in time. A little bit of experience goes a long way with this tool. Now, an interesting thing about both the spot healing brush and the normal good healing brush, is that they both offer texture healing functions, pattern healing functions. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go back to the spot healing brush tool. And notice that there's two types I can select from here. There's proximity match, which goes out and just looks for the best match inside the image. It's Photoshop's way of selecting the source for you. And then there's this other one that's called create texture. And if you use the create texture option, it's not going to be so random. It's not going to go out there and look for weird portions of the image and clone them in. You're not going to get those kinds of problems. But let me show you what you are going to get. If I paint along this seam right here, for example, it's going to get overly blurry. What Photoshop does is it looks inside the paintbrush and it tries to basically average the pixels that are in there. It tries to create this little weird texture from inside the paintbrush. And it is invariably, so far as I can figure, it is invariably too blurry. I have yet to be satisfied by that setting. So I don't use create texture, but as I said, I don't really use the spot healing brush either. I'm going to go back to the healing brush tool, contrast that to the healing brush's pattern option, which is similar. It's still working from a texture. The difference is you create the texture, and this can be extremely useful. Let me show you what I mean. The thing it does is it frees you from having to sample the image over and over again, and it allows you to just set up a neutral sort of sample that works for anything. And you can do this using this thing called the pattern maker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the filter menu, and I'm going to choose this command right here, pattern maker. And you can press this wad of keys if you want to, but I'm just going to choose the pattern maker command. And that brings up this big old pattern maker dialog box. Now, there's a ton of stuff going on inside this dialog box, but we're going to ignore most of it because actually this is a very easy feature to use as long as you don't get overwhelmed by all this falderall in the middle. Here's what I want you to do. Just select sort of a representative neutral portion of the image. That represents some of the film grain and some of the texture that's inside this face and so on. So I'm just going to select a little bit of the cheek, the same area that I've been healing from. And then I'm going to go up to this button right here. See this button that says Generate? Go ahead and click on it. And you'll see a texture generated for you down here in the lower right-hand corner of the dialog box. And this will be a repeating texture that will repeat over the course of the image. And if you like it, great. If you don't like it, just go ahead and click Generate again. And you can keep clicking Generate again over and over and over again until you get something that you really like. Let's say I like what I see right now. Okay, once you get something you like, I want you to come down here and click on this itty-bitty little Save button here. It looks like a little floppy disk. Go ahead and click on it, and then name your pattern, and I'm going to call mine Neutral Texture. and then click OK. And now at this point, I want you to do something that might not occur to you. Instead of clicking the OK button, we've already saved the texture. We already have it raring to go, so we don't need to click the OK button. If you did click the OK button, you would fill your entire image with this repeating pattern, which is the silliest thing on earth, so it's not something we want to do. Instead, we just want to click Cancel. Might make you think that we'll lose all of the stuff that we've done, but we really won't. Just go ahead and click Cancel because our pattern is waiting for us. All right, kids, now let's put that pattern in play. I want you to go ahead and turn on the pattern button up here in the options bar. And then you're going to see a list of patterns from which you can choose. These are predefined patterns that Photoshop has shipped with since the old days. They're all just wacky, ridiculous patterns. There's all kinds of additional patterns that you can choose from if you click this right pointing arrowhead and try out some of these options here inside this menu. But the one we want to use is right here. This guy right here. Notice if you hover over it, it's going to tell you it's your neutral texture. Go ahead and click on it to select it. And you are now set to paint with that texture. I'm going to press the return key in order to accept that modification and hide the drop-down palette. And I'm going to reduce the size of my cursor a little bit, and I'm going to try painting with my texture over some portions of the image. And it looks pretty good. Now, it may not look perfect, but actually it fares pretty well, I would say, inside this image. And if you want to try out a different texture, you certainly can. If you want to go back to sampling the image manually, you can do that too. I think I'll paint that mole away and see how well that does. Pretty good. So, we've now seen the clone stamp tool, we've seen the spot healing brush, we've seen the regular normal healing brush, and we've seen how to use the regular healing brush both to clone portions of the image and to paint from a repeating pattern. There's one more healing tool inside of Photoshop CS2, and that's this guy right here, the patch tool. The patch tool allows you to heal selected areas inside the image. So you actually select a portion of the image and then heal that selection. Here, let me show you how it works. I'm going to drag up this portion of the image. Let's try to heal this stuff around the mouth here. Some of the biggest tears in this face here, some of the biggest aberrations. And I'm just going to sort of drag around it. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to start talking about selection outlines. And the patch tool works basically like the lasso tool. That is to say, you just drag around the area that you want to select. So I've just circled that area with the tool that I released to generate this selection outline, these marching ants, this little animated selection outline. And then I'll drag inside the selection outline. And notice as I drag, it's previewing, not only am I moving the selection to a new location, but it's previewing how that selection is going to fit into the patched area. And as soon as I get something that I like, I might try something over in this area instead here. Once I get something I like, I just release. And then to see whether I like the effect or not, I'll go to the View menu, and I'll choose the Extras command in order to turn it off. Or I could press Command-H or Control-H on the PC in order to hide that selection outline. The patch is still there in case I decide I want to move it a little more, but I can get a sense of whether I like my patch or not. And in fact, I love my patch. I think my patch is great. Now notice that you have other patch options as well. So not only can you patch from the source, which is what I did, I could change the equation and patch from the destination. In other words, I drag around a bit of source stuff, turn on the destination option, and drag it over something that I want to patch. All right, so I can work the opposite way too if I want to. And then finally, I'll go ahead and turn on source again. Finally, I can select an area that I want to heal, like this area down here, and I could heal it with a pattern. So I just go ahead and click this little down pointing arrowhead, select my neutral pattern, and then click on the Use Pattern button in order to use it to heal the selection. And it works great. And by the way, I can heal any kind of selection. I don't have to use the patch tool in order to select an area. I could use one of the other selection tools instead. I could use, for example, the rectangular marquee tool. Just go ahead and select an area that I want to use as a patch, for example. Get my patch tool, set it to destination, and then drag that marquee over an area that needs to be patched. That doesn't happen to be the most terribly successful of all my patches, so I'll go ahead and undo it. But there are many, many different ways to work with the patch tool inside of Photoshop. All right, there's just a couple more things I want to show you about the dear old patch tool. I'm going to set it back to source here inside the options bar. Another way to select with the tool, if you're finding dragging with the tool to be a little hard and you're having difficulty controlling your motions, especially if you're using a mouse and, it's just a big hulking mouse and you're having problems controlling it, why then, there's another way to work. If you press the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and click with the tool, notice that you can actually create a straight-sided selection outline, like so. Then release the Option key or the Alt key in order to complete the selection. So you just have to click that way. As long as the Option or Alt key is down, you can just click away to create a straight-sided selection, much easier than dragging many times. And then I'll drag that to a different location, see how it fares, looks great, fine. And then you'll notice up here in the options bar, there's one more option, this option that's called transparent. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to select all the way around the mouth. Now, if I were to drag to a different location and release, check out what happens. It goes ahead and seals up this guy's mouth. Poor guy. But if I set things to transparent, if I turn transparent on and move it to a different location and release, I keep his mouth, I just end up texturizing it. So I add this texture from the side of the face and sort of heap it on the mouth, sort of integrate it into the mouth. So it goes ahead and merges those two details. And now let's fade to the final version of this image, all fixed up using the patch tool and the healing brushes inside Photoshop CS2. And just for the sake of comparison, here's the before version of the image. Here's the after. Who knew? It's Star Trek's Data. And if you can heal these kinds of problems, these deep rifts in the surface of a statue, just imagine the kinds of fixes you can perform on a real person's face, the way you can take care of scars, wrinkles, and other defects inside a client or loved one's face using these wonderful, brilliantly executed tools.